and I gave you a lawful order, paramedic.
And I'm following my lawful duty to provide life-saving care. Your order is interfering with that duty. Now, you can either help, or you can step back and let me do my job.
You're under arrest.
The alert tone ripped through the cab of the ambulance with the subtlety of a lightning strike. It was a sound Imani Washington knew better than her own heartbeat, a shrill electronic scream that meant someone's world was collapsing. Ambulance 21, respond code 3. Motor vehicle collision with injury, Interstate 75/85 northbound, just south of the Brookwood interchange. Single patient, reported unconscious. Dispatch 21 is responding. Imani's voice was a calm counterpoint to the rising chaos, a smooth, steady alto that had talked down hysterical family members and brought order to the most violent scenes. She was 28 years old, with eyes that held a wisdom far beyond her years, and hands that moved with the practiced economy of a master craftsman. At the wheel, her partner, Rick Gallo, a burly, graying veteran with a mustache that had seen more tragedy than most people see in a lifetime, was already wrestling the heavy vehicle into the flow of Atlanta traffic. The siren's first guttural whoop tore through the humid Georgia air, a promise of help on its way. The downtown connector was its usual self, a raging, barely contained river of steel and frustration. Cars, trucks, and buses were packed together, a monument to the city's perpetual motion. Rick, with the instincts of a seasoned pilot, found the seams. He nudged the ambulance through lanes, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his focus absolute. In the back, Imani was a blur of controlled motion. This was her sanctuary, her office. The space between the call and the patient was where she became the truest version of herself. She pulled on a pair of purple nitrile gloves, the familiar snap a small grounding ritual. Her mind was already on the scene, building a tactical map from the fragments dispatch had provided. Unconscious after an MVC, she said aloud, more to herself than to Rick. We're thinking C-spine precautions first. Airway management. Could be a head injury, could be internal bleeding, or it could be a medical event that caused the crash. Always a lottery, kid, Rick grunted, expertly maneuvering around a car that had frozen in panic. Imani had been a paramedic for 6 years, ever since finishing her program at Grady. She'd grown up in the city, in a neighborhood where the wail of sirens was the nightly soundtrack. She had seen firsthand what happened in the minutes before help arrived. She had seen the fear, the helplessness. That was why she was here. She wasn't just treating symptoms, she was fighting back against the chaos that had defined so much of her childhood. She was the one who ran toward the noise. Her mind was a library of protocols, a swift, silent triage of possibilities. She laid out the cervical collar, checked the suction, prepped the intubation kit. Each item was an extension of her will, a tool to cheat death. She knew that the person waiting for them on that hot asphalt wasn't a statistic. They were a father, a daughter, a brother. They had a life, a story, and her job was to make sure that story didn't end today on the side of a highway. The traffic ahead had solidified into a wall. Even with the siren clearing a path, their progress slowed to a crawl. Imani could see the scene now, 100 yards ahead. A silver sedan was accordioned against the concrete median, its front end a mangled ruin of metal and glass. A small crowd of bystanders had gathered, a ring of helpless voyeurs. "There he is," Rick said, pointing. "Looks like they pulled him out." On the shoulder of the interstate, sprawled on the grimy asphalt, was a man. Even from this distance, his stillness was terrifying. Imani grabbed the jump bag, a 40-pound pack containing everything she needed for the first 5 minutes of critical care, and unbuckled her seatbelt. The ambulance hadn't even come to a full stop before her feet hit the ground. The heat rose from the pavement in shimmering waves, and the roar of passing traffic was a physical force. But for Imani, it all faded into the background. Her world had narrowed to the man on the ground. She was moving before Rick had even killed the engine, her long strides eating up the distance. The clock was ticking. It always was. And she was the only one who could make it slow down. As Imani knelt beside the patient, the universe shrank to the few square feet of asphalt they occupied. The noise of the connector, the oppressive Georgia sun, the horrified faces of the onlookers, it all became a distant, muffled hum. Her focus was absolute, a powerful lens directed at the man whose life was in her hands. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a business suit now ruined with dirt and a dark, spreading stain of what looked like engine oil. His face was a ghastly shade of gray, his lips tinged with blue. A bystander, a young man in a band t-shirt, was performing chest compressions with more panic than technique. "I'm a paramedic," Imani announced, her voice cutting through the man's frantic counting. "I'm taking over. What happened?" He swerved and hit the wall," the young man stammered, backing away with a look of profound relief. "We pulled him out. He wasn't breathing." Imani's gloved fingers immediately went to the man's carotid artery, pressing into the soft tissue of his neck. Underneath the waxy, cool skin, she felt it. A flutter. It was weak, thready, and dangerously fast, but it was there. "He's got a pulse," she called out to Rick, who was now at her side with the stretcher and the cardiac monitor. "He's not in arrest, but we're close." This changed everything. It was not a simple cardiac arrest. The man's heart was beating, but it was failing, caught in a chaotic, inefficient rhythm that wasn't pumping enough oxygenated blood to his brain. Rick, a seamless extension of Imani's own thoughts and training, immediately began setting up the oxygen tank. They moved with an unspoken synergy, a dance honed over hundreds of calls. Imani took out a pair of trauma shears and sliced through the man's expensive shirt and tie, exposing his chest. His breathing was agonal, shallow, gasping breaths that were doing little more than moving air in and out of his mouth. She attached the sticky defibrillator pads to his chest, one below the collarbone, the other on his side beneath his armpit. The monitor flickered to life, its screen displaying a frantic, jagged line. "He's in VTAC," Imani confirmed, her voice tight with professional urgency. Ventricular tachycardia. The heart's lower chambers were firing off at a machine gun pace, too fast to properly fill with blood. It was a prelude to cardiac arrest, a ticking bomb. "Rick, I need an 18-gauge IV, wide-open saline drip," she commanded. While Rick expertly prepared the IV line, his large, steady hands a paradox of power and grace, Imani worked on the man's airway. She inserted a hard plastic oropharyngeal airway to keep his tongue from blocking his throat and fitted a non-rebreather mask over his face, flooding his starving lungs with 100% oxygen. Every action was deliberate, precise, and executed under immense pressure. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument, was already 3 steps ahead. The VTAC was unstable. If they didn't break this rhythm, his heart would give out. She ran through the ACLS, Advanced Cardiac Life Support, algorithm in her head. The pulse was still there, so defibrillation wasn't the first move. They needed medication. "Lines in," Rick announced less than 30 seconds later. "Give me 150 milligrams of amiodarone, slow push," Imani ordered. She reached into her jump bag, her fingers finding the small glass vial of the antiarrhythmic drug without looking. This was the delicate, high-stakes ballet of emergency medicine, performed on the world's most dangerous stage. She drew up the correct dosage into a syringe, her movements fluid and certain. The patient's life was balanced on a razor's edge, and her hands were the only thing keeping him from falling. The man on the ground let out a low moan, his body tensing. His eyes, which had been closed, fluttered open for a second, but they were unfocused, seeing nothing. It was in this moment of intense, focused criticality, as Rick was preparing to inject the life-saving medication into the IV port, that a new sound cut through the air, the sharp, authoritative chirp of a different kind of siren. Imani didn't look up. She couldn't. Her patient was her entire world. Every second was precious. Every heartbeat was a battle won. She held the syringe, ready to take it from Rick after he pushed the first dose of medication. Nothing else mattered. The patient, the monitor, the medicine. That was the Holy Trinity. Everything else was just noise. The police cruiser, a black and white Ford Interceptor, pulled onto the shoulder with an aggressive finality, its tires crunching on the gravel and road debris. It stopped less than 20 feet behind the ambulance, its piercing red and blue lights adding a frantic, strobing chaos to the already tense scene. The driver's side door swung open, and a police officer emerged. He was young, probably not much older than Imani herself, with a bulldog's build and a tightly shaved head that emphasized the rigid set of his jaw. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He wore a pair of reflective aviator sunglasses that completely hid his eyes, creating an impassive, intimidating mask. His nameplate read, K. Brennan. He strode toward the scene with a purposeful gait, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered Glock. It was a posture of ownership, a non-verbal announcement that he was now in command. The small crowd of bystanders who had been watching Imani and Rick with a mix of awe and horror instinctively shuffled back, parting for the uniform. Imani was vaguely aware of his presence, a new shape in her peripheral vision. She assumed he was there to do what officers usually did at scenes like this, secure the area, manage traffic, and offer assistance. She was focused on the cardiac monitor, watching the jagged rhythm, her mind calculating the next steps. Rick had just finished pushing the amiodarone into the IV line. "Meds are in," Rick confirmed, his eyes darting from the IV port to the monitor. "Good. Let's give it a minute to circulate," Imani said. "If it doesn't convert, we're going to have to cardiovert." It was then that the officer's voice cut into their focused bubble. "I need to see your driver's license and registration. Paramedic certification, too." The voice was sharp, impatient, and utterly devoid of situational awareness. It was so jarringly out of place that for a moment, Imani thought he must be talking to someone else. She didn't look up. Her patient's blood pressure was dropping, a sign the unstable rhythm was beginning to take its toll. "Sir, I'm in the middle of treating a critical patient," she said, her voice firm but respectful, her eyes still locked on the monitor. "My partner can help you with whatever you need as soon as we're stabilized." Officer Brennan took another 2 steps closer, his shadow falling over Imani and the man on the ground. "I'm not talking to your partner, I'm talking to you. I need to see your identification. Now." This time the demand was louder, edged with an unmistakable tone of irritation. It was the voice of a man who was not used to being told to wait. Imani finally risked a glance up. The reflective sunglasses stared back at her, a blank, inhuman void. His entire demeanor radiated an aggressive energy that set off a primal alarm bell deep in her gut. This wasn't an officer here to help. This was an officer here to assert control. "Officer, with all due respect," Imani said, forcing her tone to remain even, professional. De-escalation was a part of her job, too. "This man is in unstable ventricular tachycardia. He is seconds away from full cardiac arrest. My absolute priority right now is keeping him alive. I cannot stop treatment." A muscle in Officer Brennan's jaw twitched. "This is an official police investigation into a traffic accident. Failure to identify yourself to a law enforcement officer is against the law. Are you refusing a lawful order?" The words were a splash of icy water. Investigation? Lawful order? This man was dying. The only investigation that mattered right now was the one she was conducting into the electrical chaos in his heart. The absurdity of the situation was staggering. A man's life was draining away on the hot asphalt, and this officer was more concerned with paperwork and authority than with the pulse that was fading under her fingertips. Something cold and hard began to form in Imani's stomach. This wasn't about procedure, this was about power, and he had chosen the worst possible moment to try and prove he had it. Imani made a conscious decision. She would not be baited. She would not be distracted. Her duty was singular and sacred. She turned her full attention back to the man on the ground, effectively dismissing the officer standing over her. The patient's rhythm on the monitor was deteriorating, the jagged peaks becoming more erratic. The amiodarone wasn't working fast enough. "Rick, he's not converting. The pressure is still dropping," she said, her voice a clinical, focused instrument. "Get the pads connected. We're going to have to shock him. Set the monitor to synchronized cardioversion, 120 joules. Rick, who had been watching the exchange with Officer Brennan with wide, disbelieving eyes, snapped back into action. His training overrode his shock. He reached for the defibrillator controls on the monitor. "Did you not hear me?" Officer Brennan's voice was now a low growl, inches from her ear. He had stepped even closer, his presence a suffocating, aggressive weight. "I gave you a lawful order, paramedic. And I am following my lawful duty as a licensed medical professional to provide life-saving care," Imani retorted, her eyes still locked on the monitor, her fingers palpating the patient's weakening pulse. She refused to raise her voice. She would meet his aggression with unshakable professionalism. "Georgia state law protects my right and responsibility to treat a critical patient. Interfering with that treatment is a felony. Now, you can either help us by keeping the area clear, or you can step back and let us do our jobs." A dangerous silence fell. The only sounds were the increasingly frantic beeps of the cardiac monitor and the roar of the highway. The bystanders were watching, a captive audience to a bizarre and terrifying standoff. Phones were starting to emerge, their small black lenses silently recording. "I need to see your identification," Brennan repeated, his voice low and menacing. He had shifted tactics. If he couldn't bully her with orders, he would bog her down in procedure. "My identification is in my wallet in the ambulance," Imani said, not looking up. "You are welcome to ask my partner to retrieve it, or you can verify my credentials and license number through your dispatch. But I am not stopping treatment on a dying man to show you my driver's license." "So, you're refusing to identify yourself?" "I am refusing to abandon my patient," Imani corrected him, her patience a deep and usually unshakable well, finally beginning to run dry. "There's a difference." The monitor blared a new, more insistent alarm. The man's rhythm had degenerated further. His pulse was now barely palpable. "He's about to arrest," Imani said, a new urgency in her voice. "Rick, charge the monitor." "Charging," Rick confirmed, pressing the button. A high-pitched whine began to emanate from the machine as it built up the electrical charge. "Clear!" Imani shouted, pulling her hands away from the patient. She looked at Rick and the bystanders. "Everybody clear!" As Rick leaned in, his thumbs hovering over the two orange shock buttons, Officer Brennan moved. He didn't grab her. Instead, he stepped directly between her and the patient, planting his polished boots on the asphalt. His body was a physical barrier between her and her patient's only chance at survival. "You are obstructing my investigation," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Imani's professional composure finally cracked. Her anger was not hot and loud, but cold and sharp. "You are obstructing emergency medical care," she shot back, rising from her knees to face him. "This man is my only priority. For the last time, officer, move out of my way." They were locked in an impossible stalemate. A paramedic ready to deliver a life-saving electrical shock. A police officer standing in her way, his arms crossed, a symbol of the law becoming an obstacle to life itself. The air crackled with tension. The whine of the fully charged defibrillator was a piercing cry, a countdown to a tragedy of his making. The standoff felt like an eternity. Seconds stretched, each one a hammer blow to the patient's oxygen-starved brain. The bystanders, no longer silent observers, began to protest. "Hey, man, what are you doing? Let her work!" one man shouted. "He's dying, for God's sake!" a woman cried out, her voice cracking. Officer Brennan's head snapped toward the crowd. "Stay back, all of you! This is an official police scene!" he yelled, pointing a finger. That brief moment of distraction was the only opening Imani needed. She dropped back to her knees, attempting to reach around Brennan's legs to get to the patient and the controls. "Rick, I'm clear," she said, trying to reclaim the momentum. "On my mark." But she never finished the sentence. As she shifted her weight, Brennan's hand clamped down on her upper arm. His grip was like a vice, a sudden, shocking violation that sent a jolt through her body. "I told you to stop," he growled, his face now inches from hers, the blank sunglasses reflecting a distorted image of her own shocked expression. You don't get to decide what happens here. I do. The world seemed to warp and slow down. The feel of his fingers digging into her bicep. The sight of her patient's face, now completely ashen and slack-jawed. The sound of Rick's sharp intake of breath. The piercing, continuous whine from the defibrillator, its charge waiting to be delivered. This was the point of no return. This was no longer a jurisdictional dispute. This was a physical assault. "Take your hand off me, officer," Imani said, her voice dangerously quiet, each word sharpened with cold fury. "You are actively interfering with a medical resuscitation, right now." "You're under arrest," Brennan declared, his voice booming with a sense of finality, as if the words themselves were a magical incantation that proved him right. The statement was so profoundly, breathtakingly absurd that for a split second, Imani could only stare at him. Arrested? For what? For refusing to let a man die? Rick froze, half crouched over the patient, his face a mask of disbelief. The crowd gasped. "Arrested for what?" Imani demanded, yanking her arm from his grasp with a sharp, decisive movement. She immediately turned back to her patient, her focus snapping back to the mission. "Rick, we have to shock him now." She was done with him. Done talking, done negotiating, done trying to reason with a man who was clearly operating in a different reality. But as she reached for the defibrillator buttons herself, Brennan acted. He grabbed her again, not by the arm this time, but by the shoulder, and violently yanked her backward. She stumbled, losing her balance. The jump bag, which had been open beside her, tipped over, its carefully organized contents spilling across the dirty asphalt. Syringes, medication vials, sterile gauze, and intubation tools, the instruments of life-saving, scattered like discarded toys. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting a law enforcement officer," Brennan shouted, his voice ringing with a bizarre kind of triumph. He spun her around with surprising force, wrenching her arms behind her back. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around her wrists. Click, click, click. The sharp, ratcheting sound was the loudest thing Imani had ever heard. It was the sound of complete insanity, the sound of a world turned upside down, where a paramedic fighting for a life was treated like a violent felon. The bite of the metal into her skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. She was a healer, and she was in chains. "My patient!" she cried out, her professional composure finally shattering, her voice raw with desperation as she twisted to look back at the scene. "Rick, don't stop! You have to shock him! You have to get him to the hospital!" Her plea seemed to break the spell that had frozen Rick. He dropped back to the patient's side, his hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and rage. The monitor was now blaring a flatline alarm. The VTAC was gone. The patient was in full cardiac arrest. "I've lost the pulse!" Rick yelled. "Starting compressions!" He was alone now, a single first responder fighting a losing battle, his partner being dragged away in handcuffs. The scene exploded into chaos. The construction workers and other bystanders who had been hesitant witnesses were now an angry mob. They surged forward, their cell phones held high, a forest of lenses documenting the outrage. "What the hell are you doing? She was helping him! You're killing him, you psycho! We're all recording this, you son of a bitch!" Officer Brennan seemed momentarily taken aback by the crowd's fury, but his jaw hardened. He shoved Imani toward his patrol car, his hand planted firmly in the center of her back. "Get back, all of you! Get back now or you'll be next!" he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and panic. As he forced her away from the scene, Imani's eyes remained locked on her patient, a man whose name she would later learn was Frank Miller, a man whose life had been in her hands just seconds before. She saw Rick, his face a mask of desperate concentration, performing chest compressions, his powerful arms pumping rhythmically on the man's chest. A bystander, the same young man from before, knelt by Rick's side, holding the IV bag aloft, trying to help in any way he could. She watched in horror as the seconds stretched into a minute, then 2. She knew with a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty that this delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven delay, was costing Frank Miller precious heart muscle, precious brain cells, precious life. Every second that ticked by while she was being marched to a police car was a second his chances of survival plummeted. This was no longer just interference, it was a potential death sentence, and Officer Brennan was the executioner. The door of the patrol car was hot to the touch. The heat from the black vinyl upholstery washed over her as Brennan pushed her unceremoniously into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing her in a plastic and metal cage. Through the reinforced glass and the metal grate, the scene played out like a silent, horrific movie. She saw Rick, still pumping away on the patient's chest, his mouth moving frantically as he shouted into his shoulder radio, likely screaming for another unit, for a supervisor, for anyone who could fix this nightmare. She saw the construction workers surrounding him, some trying to direct traffic, creating a protective, defiant circle around the patient, their bodies a barrier against the officer who had so profoundly betrayed his duty. She was a paramedic, cuffed in the back of a police car, watching a man die. The person who had put her there was the very person who was supposed to be her partner in these life-or-death struggles. He hadn't just arrested her, he had abandoned his most fundamental duty. In that moment, sitting in the suffocating heat of the car, the vinyl seat sticking to her uniform, a cold, clear resolution formed in the pit of her stomach. This would not stand. Officer Kyle Brennan had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. He thought he had won a contest of wills, asserted his dominance on the side of a highway. What he had actually done was ignite a fire that would consume him. The wail of another siren grew closer. Help was finally coming for Rick, but it was help that should never have been needed. Minutes later, an eternity in cardiac care, another ambulance screamed onto the shoulder. Two new paramedics, a man and a woman Imani knew vaguely from another station, jumped out and rushed to the scene. There was a frantic exchange of words. Rick, breathless from the compressions, pointed from the patient to Imani, locked in the back of the cruiser. The female paramedic's head whipped around, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw Imani's face pressed against the glass. The new team worked with desperate efficiency, taking over compressions, preparing their own defibrillator. They loaded Frank Miller onto their stretcher, a flurry of controlled, expert motion. Imani watched as they lifted him, his body limp, his face a deathly gray. Was he still alive? Was there any hope left? The not knowing was a physical torment, a hot poker twisting in her gut. She had failed him. She hadn't been allowed to fail, she had been forced to fail, and the distinction felt meaningless in the face of the tragic outcome she was witnessing. Officer Brennan finally climbed into the driver's seat, the car dipping under his weight. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting hers in the reflection. There was no remorse, no uncertainty in his gaze, only a cold, self-satisfied hardness. He had enforced his will, and in his mind, that was all that mattered. He started the engine and pulled away from the chaos he had created, leaving the frantic resuscitation effort behind. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the crackle of the police radio, a stream of mundane chatter that felt like it was broadcasting from another universe. "That man is going to die," Imani said, her voice flat, the words breaking the silence. She needed to say it. She needed him to acknowledge the consequence of his actions. "Because of you. Because you couldn't wait 2 minutes for an ID while his heart was failing. I hope your ego is worth a man's life." Brennan's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You should have followed a lawful order," he said, his voice a monotone. "This is on you. You resisted." Imani leaned her head back against the hard plastic seat and closed her eyes. It was like arguing with a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. He had already convicted her in his mind to justify his own catastrophic misjudgment. The drive to the Atlanta City Detention Center was a journey from one battlefield to another. She had lost the first skirmish on the highway. She would not lose the war. The detention center was a place Imani had been to dozens of times, but always through the ambulance bay, always as a respected professional clearing an intoxicated or injured person for booking. Now, She was led through the main sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind her, echoing with a sickening finality. Officer Brennan gripped her arm, steering her through the corridors as if she were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered her dark blue paramedic's uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and curiosity rippled through the room. A medic in cuffs was not a common sight. Brennan pushed her toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a stout, older black woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, and a nameplate that read, Sergeant Davis. "Got one for booking," Brennan announced, his voice unnecessarily loud. "Obstruction and resisting." Sergeant Davis looked up from her paperwork, her gaze falling on Imani, then on Brennan. She raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Resisting who? Her?" She looked back at Imani. "I know you. You're Washington from Grady EMS. You brought in that kid who fell off the roof last week. What in God's name is going on, Brennan?" "She refused to follow a lawful order at an accident scene," Brennan said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Interfered with my investigation." "What investigation?" Sergeant Davis pressed, her tone sharp. She clearly wasn't buying it. "I heard the chatter on the scanner. MVC on the connector, man down, cardiac event. What exactly did she obstruct? His heartbeat?" The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled. Brennan's face flushed a deep red. "She refused to provide identification and became belligerent." "Sergeant, I was actively treating a critical patient," Imani interjected, her voice calm and measured, despite the rage simmering inside her. "I informed the officer that his request was interfering with life-saving care and that I would provide my credentials as soon as the patient was stabilized. His life was the priority." Sergeant Davis's eyes narrowed, looking from Imani's resolute face to Brennan's defensive one. The veteran sergeant had been on the job for nearly 30 years. She could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. "You pulled a medic away from a critical patient to ask for her driver's license," she asked Brennan, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Is that what you're telling me?" "I was securing the scene," Brennan insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bluster under the weight of her glare. Sergeant Davis just shook her head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on her face. She turned to the booking officer. "Process her, and be quick about it. Get her union rep on the phone." She shot a final withering glare at Brennan. "My office. Now." The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Imani's fingerprints were taken, the ink smearing on her skin. A mugshot was taken, the flash of the camera capturing her exhausted but defiant expression. She was instructed to remove her personal belongings, her wallet, which contained the very driver's license and paramedic certification that started this whole nightmare, her phone, her watch. Each item was placed in a clear plastic bag and cataloged with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. After the paperwork was completed, a young officer led Imani down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the officer muttered, unable to meet her eyes. "It'll just be until we can get things sorted out." The door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. Imani was alone. The cell was small, cold, and brutally simple, a concrete bench and a steel toilet. The smell of stale sweat and fear clung to the air. She sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through her uniform. For the first time since the call came in hours ago, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. She had dedicated her life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm. And for doing her job, for doing what was right, she had been locked in a cage. She put her head in her hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, and she was going to burn it to the ground. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. Maya measured its passage by the changing shifts of light through the small, high window and the distant, muffled sounds of the station. She heard phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for her injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation, a fresh layer of insult on the injury. She replayed the encounter with Brennan in her mind, dissecting every word, every action. Could she have handled it differently? Should she have been more compliant, shown him the ID, and hoped for the best? The answer every time was a resolute no. Compliance would have been a betrayal of her patient. It would have meant conceding that a police officer's demand for paperwork superseded a paramedic's duty to save a life. It was a principle she would not, could not, surrender. But the cost of that principle was this: a cold, concrete bench and the gnawing uncertainty about Frank Miller's fate. She'd been in the cell for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but a quicker, more energetic cadence. A man in a tailored gray suit stopped in front of her cell door. He was in his late 40s with a sharp, intelligent face, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single sweeping glance. He carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Imani Washington?" he asked, his voice calm and confident. Imani stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is Ben Carter. I'm an attorney with the Paramedics Union. Your partner Rick called your supervisor, and your supervisor called me. I came as fast as I could." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Imani. She wasn't alone anymore. The system she had dedicated her life to was now fighting for her. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Carter said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from his briefcase. "I've already had a very pointed conversation with Sergeant Davis. She's displeased with her officer's conduct, to put it mildly. But the arrest report has been filed. Brennan is doubling down, claiming you were hostile and non-compliant from the start. We need to build our case, starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened, from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Imani began her story, recounting the entire event with the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history. She described the dispatch call, the patient's condition, the VTAC rhythm, and her desperate attempts to stabilize him. Then she described Officer Brennan's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate demands, his refusal to listen, his escalation, the physical assault, and the arrest. Carter listened intently, his pen flying across the page, his expression growing grimmer with every word. He would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. "Did he ever state what crime he was investigating other than your failure to identify?" "No, just that it was an accident scene." "Did he ever ask about the patient's condition? Did he show any concern for the man's well-being?" "None. His only concern was seeing my ID." Carter nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. "That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved. His refusal to accept that is key." He looked up from his notes. "Imani, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call, it was illegal. Georgia state law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you. This is a classic case of what we lawyers call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. He arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law." True to Ben Carter's word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Davis was standing there, her expression stern but her eyes holding a trace of apology. "You're being released on your own recognizance, Washington. The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to stick." She handed Imani the plastic bag containing her personal belongings. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice low, "I'm sorry this happened. He was way out of line." Imani just nodded, taking her property. The apology was a small concession, but it was something. As she walked out of the station with Carter at her side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, she felt like she was surfacing after being held underwater. She was free, but she wasn't whole. A part of her was still back on that highway, fighting for a life that had been needlessly endangered. Rick was waiting for her in the parking lot, leaning against the side of their ambulance. His uniform was rumpled and his face was etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He straightened up as soon as he saw her, rushing forward to pull her into a firm, brotherly hug. "Imani, my God, are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been better," she said, pulling back, her mind immediately going to the one thing that mattered. "Tell me about the patient, Frank Miller. What's the latest?" Rick's face clouded over. He took a deep breath. "It's bad, Imani, really bad. I followed the other rig to the hospital, stayed until they took him up to the cath lab. He went into full arrest right after Brennan took you. I did CPR for almost 6 minutes straight before the other crew got there and we could shock him." The words landed like stones in her stomach. 6 minutes. An eternity of no blood flow to the brain. "They got a pulse back on the way to the ER," Rick continued, his voice strained. "But he was down for too long. The cardiologist came out to talk to his wife. Because of the prolonged arrest, they're worried about massive heart damage. But that's not the worst of it. They think he has a severe anoxic brain injury." Anoxic brain injury. The 3 most dreaded words in emergency medicine. It meant the brain had been starved of oxygen for so long that cells had begun to die. It was catastrophic, irreversible, and life-altering. "The delay, Imani," Rick said, his voice cracking with a fury he could no longer contain. "The doctor said the delay in defibrillation was the direct cause. He said those minutes Brennan stole from us. They likely turned a survivable event into a tragedy." The world tilted on its axis. Every paramedic lives with the fear of losing a patient. It's a heavy, ever-present burden. But this was different. This wasn't a loss to a disease or an injury that was too severe. This was a loss to a man's ego. Those precious minutes Brennan had wasted while he postured and demanded and finally arrested her were the minutes Frank Miller's mind was being destroyed. The image of Brennan's smug face flashed in her mind, and her simmering anger ignited into a white-hot flame. "His family?" Imani asked, her voice tight. "His wife and 2 adult kids are there. They're devastated. They know what happened. Some of the bystanders who recorded it on their phones stayed and talked to them, and to the police supervisor who eventually showed up." Ben Carter, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. His expression was grim. "This confirms our path forward," he said, his voice cold and hard. "The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Brennan's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, Imani. We're talking about a man who will likely never be the same again, if he survives, because a police officer couldn't handle being told no by a black woman who was trying to do her job." They drove to Carter's office, a sleek, modern space in downtown Atlanta that felt a world away from the grit of the holding cell. For the next 3 hours, Imani gave a formal, recorded statement. Carter's team was already at work, filing motions, contacting witnesses, and drafting the initial complaint. A paralegal brought in sworn affidavits from 3 of the bystanders who had recorded the incident on their phones. Their videos, though shaky, were damning. They clearly showed Imani providing medical care. They captured Brennan's aggressive demands. And they recorded the moment he physically pulled her off the patient and cuffed her. It was all there. Undeniable. The lawsuit was filed electronically at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold, legal language the horrifying events of the previous day. It named Officer Kyle Brennan and the city of Atlanta as defendants. The legal claims were extensive and powerful. "We are filing a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act," Carter explained to Imani as they reviewed the final draft. "We will argue that Officer Brennan, acting under the color of law, deprived you of your Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful seizure and your 14th Amendment right to due process. His actions were not a mistake. They were a willful and reckless disregard for your constitutional rights and for the life of your patient. He pointed to another section. Furthermore, we are adding state-level claims for false arrest, battery, and intentional interference with emergency medical care. We will be suing Officer Brennan individually, which is crucial. It means he can be held personally liable. And we are suing the city of Atlanta for failure to train and supervise its officers. We are not just going after the soldier. We are going after the army that sent him into battle unprepared. The lawsuit sought unspecified damages, but the complaint made it clear they would be substantial, covering the violation of Imani's civil rights, the emotional distress and trauma, and the damage to her professional reputation. Within an hour, the media storm began. A local news station, tipped off by Carter's office, ran an exclusive with footage from one of the bystanders' cell phones. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle. A hero paramedic arrested by an overzealous cop while saving a man's life. The image of Imani, a black woman in a paramedic's uniform, being forced into the back of a patrol car while her white partner frantically worked on a dying patient, was an incendiary and powerful symbol. The video went viral. By lunchtime, it was the top story on national news websites. Imani's phone, which she'd gotten back with her other belongings, began to light up with calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues from across the state, all expressing their shock and unwavering support. The Atlanta Fire Rescue Department, which oversaw EMS, issued a forceful statement standing firmly behind Imani, calling her actions heroic and in accordance with the highest standards of patient care. The Atlanta Police Department, in contrast, issued a terse defensive statement saying the incident was under internal investigation and that Officer Brennan had been placed on administrative desk duty pending the outcome. The battle lines had been drawn. Imani, with the full backing of her union and the formidable legal skill of Ben Carter, stood on one side. On the other stood Officer Brennan, and a city bureaucracy that would now go to extraordinary lengths to protect itself and its employee from the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war, a war Imani had never asked for, but one she was now fully committed to winning. It was no longer just about her. It was about Frank Miller, lying in a hospital bed, his future stolen from him. It was about her partner, Rick, who had been forced to watch it all unfold. It was about every paramedic who had ever been bullied or disrespected on a scene. And it was about a city that had allowed a man like Kyle Brennan to carry a badge and a gun, and had failed to teach him that his first duty was not to command, but to serve. The days that followed were a blur. Imani was placed on administrative leave, a standard procedure she found deeply frustrating. She wanted to be in her ambulance, not sitting at home watching her own arrest play out on a loop on cable news. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her life, her career, her very identity dissected by strangers. Pundits debated the case, some championing her as a hero, others defending the officer, arguing for the necessity of absolute compliance with police orders. But the video was a powerful rebuttal to any defense of Brennan's actions. The court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. Now, they just needed the actual court to catch up. In the world of high-stakes litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of resolve. It's a calculated probe, designed to see if the plaintiff is serious or if they can be scared off or bought off cheaply. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Ben Carter received the call he had been expecting from the City of Atlanta's legal department. "They want to talk settlement," he told Imani over the phone. "They're trying to gauge how serious we are. See if they can make this go away before it gets any more embarrassing for them." "What are they offering?" Imani asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Carter let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $25,000 for your trouble. They called it a nuisance value settlement." Imani was silent for a moment, the sheer audacity of the offer sucking the air from her lungs. $25,000. It wasn't a settlement, it was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head and a run along now. It was a pittance meant to make a public relations inconvenience disappear. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of rights and a near-fatal dereliction of duty, but as a problem to be managed. It was an offer that completely ignored the catastrophic, life-altering injuries suffered by Frank Miller, an injury that was now inextricably tied to her own case. It was an offer that said her dignity, her professionalism, her trauma, and his life were worth less than the price of a new police cruiser. "Tell them no," Imani said, her voice laced with ice. "Tell them I'll see them in court." "That's what I thought you'd say," Carter replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure and the media attention would make you fold. They misjudged you." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical error. They had mistaken Imani's quiet professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that her fight was no longer just about her own vindication. It had become about Frank Miller. Frank had survived, but just barely. He had spent 10 days in a medically induced coma. When he finally woke up, the doctors delivered the devastating news. The prolonged lack of oxygen to his brain had caused severe cognitive and motor deficits. He had trouble speaking, and the right side of his body was partially paralyzed. His heart, damaged by the extended arrest, was now dangerously weak. He would require round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. He was 48 years old, and his life as he knew it, as a husband, a father, an accountant who loved to hike on weekends, was over. His family had retained their own lawyer and were preparing a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city. The two cases, while legally distinct, were now morally and factually inseparable. Every victory for Imani would be a victory for Frank. The city's refusal to take her lawsuit seriously had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of silencing her, it galvanized her, and it enraged the public. When news of the nuisance value offer leaked to the press, a strategic and anonymous leak from Carter's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Imani's fire station to help with any uncovered expenses was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. Paramedics from as far away as California and New York sent messages of solidarity. She had become an unwilling symbol for every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. The pressure on the city mounted. The police chief held a press conference where he was hammered with questions about Officer Brennan's disciplinary record. It was revealed that Brennan, in his short 5-year career, had accumulated nearly a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority, none of which had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. This wasn't a good cop having a bad day. This was a bad cop having a typical day, only this time it was caught on camera. For Imani, life had become surreal. She was on paid leave from the job she loved, spending her days in meetings with lawyers instead of responding to 911 calls. She tried to keep a low profile, but her face was everywhere. She'd be recognized at the grocery store, with strangers stopping her to shake her hand and thank her for standing up. The attention was uncomfortable, but it strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. Carter used the intense media scrutiny to his advantage, pressing the city hard in the initial stages of the legal process. "We're moving into the discovery phase," he told her during one of their strategy sessions. "This is where they have to turn over everything. We've requested Brennan's complete personnel file, all internal emails and memos related to the incident, body camera footage from any other officers who responded, and, most importantly, the one piece of evidence that will decide this case. The unedited, full-length footage from Officer Kyle Brennan's own body camera. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Brennan thinks his written report will protect him. The city thinks their lawyers can spin this. But the camera doesn't spin, it just shows. And what it's going to show a jury is a hero trying to save a life, and a bully with a badge who was willing to let a man die to prove a point. The discovery process in a federal lawsuit is a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears. It's a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents, data, and procedural motions. For months, Ben Carter's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city, training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and Officer Brennan's complete unredacted personnel file, which confirmed the pattern of aggressive behavior the media had reported. But all of it was secondary to the single digital file they had been waiting for. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier. The body camera footage. Carter had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. Imani sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Rick was there too, for support and to corroborate the sequence of events. He had been a rock for Imani through the whole ordeal, a constant, reassuring presence. "Are you ready for this?" Carter asked her gently. Imani took a deep breath and nodded. "Play it." The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the ground as Officer Brennan got out of his patrol car. The audio was crystal clear, the roar of the highway, the crackle of his radio. Then he began walking toward the scene. The camera's perspective was his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation to come. He approached the circle of bystanders, his voice already sharp. "What's going on here? Everybody back up, give them space." Then the camera centered on her, a version of Imani kneeling on the ground, her back to the camera, completely engrossed in her patient. The footage was visceral, immediate. It captured the gray, sweaty pallor of Frank Miller's skin, the shallow, desperate gasps for air he was taking. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that he was in extreme distress. The audio was even more damning than Imani remembered. "I need to see your driver's license and registration. Paramedic certification, too," Brennan's voice commanded, cold and devoid of any empathy. "Sir, I'm in the middle of treating a critical patient," her own voice replied, calm and focused. The camera showed her not even looking up, her hands moving with purpose over the patient's chest. The footage perfectly corroborated her story. Her attention was and remained on saving a life. "I said step away now," Brennan's voice repeated louder this time. The camera tilted up as he stepped closer, looming over the scene. It captured Imani's quick glance up, the firmness in her voice as she explained the situation. "Officer, this is a critical medical scene. My patient's heart is in an unstable rhythm. He could go into full cardiac arrest at any moment. I cannot step away." Watching it now, from his perspective, was chilling. The camera showed no interest in the patient. It remained fixed on her, the perceived source of defiance. It recorded her clear, concise explanations of the medical emergency and her lawful duty. It recorded her offer to have her credentials verified by other means. It recorded the moment she dismissed him to instruct Rick to push the life-saving medication. The evidence was irrefutable. Then came the escalation. The camera lurched as Brennan stepped forward to block her. His voice, captured by the microphone inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You are obstructing my investigation." Her reply was just as clear. "You are obstructing emergency medical care." The most crucial moment was the arrest itself. The video showed Brennan's hand reaching out and grabbing her arm. It showed him yanking her away from the patient. The camera swung wildly, capturing the medical kits spilling across the ground. Then the view became a chaotic jumble of Imani's back and the sky as Brennan spun her around and forced her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect clarity by the microphone. The video continued for another 20 minutes. It showed the angry shouts of the bystanders. It showed Rick, his face a mask of desperation, taking over CPR. It showed the arrival of the second ambulance, and it showed the long, silent walk back to the patrol car, where Imani was placed in the back like a piece of cargo. When the video finally ended, the conference room was silent. Rick was shaking his head, his face pale. "That son of a bitch," he whispered. Imani felt strangely numb, vindicated but also sickened. It was all there. Every lie in Brennan's report, every self-serving statement the city had made was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Ben Carter sat back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at Imani. "In 25 years of practicing law," he said, his voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest, it recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life." He stood up and began to pace the room, energized, his legal mind firing on all cylinders. "This changes everything. Their entire strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, as uncooperative and belligerent, as he put it in his report. This video proves you were the only person in that interaction who remained calm, professional, and focused on the job at hand. Brennan wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a woman, a black woman, telling him she had more important things to do than stroke his ego." Carter stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. "The city's lawyers will see this footage and they will know their case is unwinnable. They'll come back to the table with a real settlement offer, a much bigger one. But that's not what we're going to do." He turned to Imani, his eyes glinting with a litigator's fire. "We're not going to let them bury this. We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to let 12 ordinary citizens from this city see exactly what Officer Kyle Brennan did on that highway. We're going to depose him, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath. This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, Imani. It's about getting you justice, the kind of justice that changes laws." His words hung in the air, a promise and a challenge. The path ahead would be harder, more public, and more painful than just taking a check. It would mean a trial. It would mean facing Brennan again. But as Imani looked at the determined set of her lawyer's jaw, she knew he was right. They had the truth on a hard drive, and now it was time to make sure the world saw it. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile, soundproofed confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Kyle Brennan walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. His uniform was crisp, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had on the highway. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative paramedic. He believed his badge and his version of the story would protect him. He was wrong. For the first hour, the city's attorney led Brennan through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area, and Paramedic Washington's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with his lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job. Then it was Ben Carter's turn. Carter began calmly, his questions simple and direct. "Officer Brennan, you've been with the Atlanta Police Department for 5 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes?" "Yes, sir. We receive extensive training on interagency cooperation." "And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency?" Brennan shifted in his seat. "My priority is to secure the scene for the safety of all personnel." "That wasn't my question, officer," Carter said, his voice still mild. "Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like asking for identification?" The city's attorney objected, but Carter just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Mr. Miller, was not in serious medical distress? I am not a medical professional, Brennan said stiffly. I could not make that assessment. Exactly, Carter pounced. You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing care. Is that correct? I ordered her to step back so I could secure the scene. Carter nodded slowly, then turned to his paralegal. Please play the first video exhibit. Body camera footage of Officer Brennan, timestamp 14:08:14. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the highway, and the video began. Carter had Brennan watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his initial aggressive demands. Officer, Carter said, pausing the video just after Brennan had yelled, I said step away now! At this point, you had been on scene for less than 30 seconds. You had not spoken to any witnesses. You had not assessed any potential threats. Yet you decided the most important action you could take was to interrupt the paramedic treating her patient. Why? I was establishing control of the scene, Brennan repeated, his jaw tight. Control over what exactly? A woman on her knees trying to save a man's life? Carter let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where Imani calmly explained the patient's condition. He paused it again. Officer, on this video we can hear Paramedic Washington, a 6-year veteran with an exemplary record, telling you the patient is in VTAC and could go into full cardiac arrest. Did you know what VTAC was? Brennan hesitated. I have basic first aid training. So you understood it was a life-threatening cardiac arrhythmia. I understood it was a medical situation. And yet, your response was not to ask how you could help. It was not to clear the area for her. It was to demand her identification. Is that right? It is standard procedure to identify all parties on a scene. Is it standard procedure to arrest a paramedic for prioritizing her dying patient over your request for her driver's license? Carter's voice was rising now, losing its gentle tone and taking on a hard prosecutorial edge. For the next 4 hours, Carter dismantled Brennan's story piece by piece, using the officer's own camera footage as the wrecking ball. He forced Brennan to watch himself yank Imani away from the patient. Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer. Brennan stared at the screen, his face pale. I am effecting an arrest. You are physically assaulting a licensed paramedic and preventing her from rendering aid, Carter corrected him. Did you see the medical kit spill onto the ground? Did you see the patient, Mr. Miller, lying there unattended while you focused on handcuffing Miss Washington? By the end of the deposition, Kyle Brennan was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The official transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Carter had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with Carter's relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. With the deposition a confirmed disaster for the defense and no settlement reached, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation for Imani. Ben Carter and his team put her through mock cross-examinations, peppering her with the most aggressive accusatory questions the city's lawyers could possibly devise. They wanted to prepare her for the stress of the witness stand, to ensure that her composure, which had been so powerful on the body cam footage, would hold under the pressure of a courtroom. The trial began not with a bang, but with a painstaking process known as voir dire, or jury selection. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table beside Ben Carter, watching as dozens of potential jurors were brought into the stately, wood-paneled courtroom. They were a cross-section of Atlanta. teachers, retirees, mechanics, small business owners. 12 of them would be chosen to decide her fate. The city's legal team was looking for a specific type of juror, people who were instinctively pro-law enforcement, people who believed that questioning a police officer was inherently wrong. Carter's approach was the opposite. He was searching for empathy, for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties, people who trusted medical professionals, and people who were skeptical of unchecked authority. After 2 full days, they had their jury, 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group, thoughtful and independent. Carter was pleased. The trial itself moved with a dramatic weight. Carter's first witness was not Imani, but Frank Miller's wife, a heartbroken woman who described, through tears, the man her husband used to be and the shell he had become. Next came Rick Gallo, his voice shaking with anger as he recounted how he had to watch his partner be arrested while their patient slipped into cardiac arrest. The ER doctor who treated Frank took the stand, explaining in precise clinical detail how the 6-minute delay in defibrillation had directly contributed to the severity of Frank's brain and heart damage. With each witness, Carter was building a wall of evidence around Officer Brennan, brick by brick. On the 4th day, the energy in the courtroom was electric. Carter called his final witness, Imani Washington. She walked to the stand with a quiet confidence, her testimony clear, concise, and professional. Then, Carter dimmed the lights and played the body camera footage. For 10 minutes, the jury was transported to the side of the connector. They saw the scene through Brennan's eyes. They heard his demands and her calm refusals. And then they saw it. They saw him lunge forward, grab her, and yank her away. They saw him cuff her as her medical kit spilled onto the ground. Several jurors flinched. One woman put a hand over her mouth in shock. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore, they were witnessing an assault. The defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Kyle Brennan. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. His testimony sounded hollow and absurd after everyone had seen the video. Then it was Carter's turn for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand with a quiet, surgical precision. "Officer Brennan," he began, "we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a paramedic while she was actively treating a man in cardiac distress. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, knowing what happened to Mr. Miller, is there anything you would have done differently?" It was a lifeline, a chance for Brennan to show some remorse, some humanity, some understanding of the gravity of his mistake. He could have said, "In hindsight, I should have waited." He could have said, "I misjudged the situation." But he didn't. His pride, the same pride that had caused this disaster, would not let him. "No," Brennan said, his voice defiant. "I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene." Carter let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. "No further questions, Your Honor." It was a mic drop moment. In that single defiant answer, Kyle Brennan had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that, given the chance, he would do it all again. The jurors' faces were like stone. They had seen the video and now they had seen the man. In their eyes, there was no doubt left at all. The wait for the verdict began. An hour passed, then 2. Just after 3 p.m., the bailiff announced that the jury had returned. They filed back into the box, their faces unreadable. The foreman handed a slip of paper to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. The judge read it and handed it back to the clerk to be read aloud. "In the matter of Washington versus Brennan and the city of Atlanta," the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room, "on the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the 4th Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Imani Washington." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Imani squeezed her eyes shut, tears beginning to stream down her face. Ben Carter put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff Imani Washington. On the claim of battery, we find for the plaintiff Imani Washington." The clerk paused, taking a breath before reading the final section. We will now read the damages. For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $1.9 million. The number was staggering, a clear vindication. But the foreman wasn't finished. And for punitive damages to be levied against Officer Kyle Brennan and the City of Atlanta for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $16 million. The courtroom erupted in stunned murmurs. $17.9 million. It was a thunderous, earth-shattering verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish and to send a message. The jury hadn't just sided with Imani, they had adopted her outrage. They had sent the message Carter had asked for, a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. Imani sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming sense of vindication. The jury had seen her, they had heard her, and they had believed her. Justice, hard-won and dearly bought, had finally been done. The verdict was more than a legal victory, it was an earthquake. The $17.9 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city of Atlanta and beyond. It was a headline-grabbing figure that forced an immediate and painful reckoning within the city's leadership and police department. The message from the jury was unequivocal. The old way of doing business, of protecting bad cops and ignoring systemic problems, was no longer acceptable and would come at a devastating financial cost. The first domino to fall was Officer Kyle Brennan. Less than a week after the verdict, following a rushed internal affairs investigation that suddenly found the courage to state the obvious, he was fired from the Atlanta Police Department. His career in law enforcement was over, his name forever linked to one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the state's history. But the changes didn't stop there. Facing immense public pressure and the looming even larger lawsuit from Frank Miller's family, which they quickly settled out of court for an undisclosed but reportedly massive sum, the City Council approved a sweeping overhaul of police training and policy. They brought in outside consultants to rewrite the department's protocols for interacting with other first responders. The new policy, which became known informally as the Washington Mandate, was explicit. At a medical emergency scene, the senior paramedic, or EMT, was in command of patient care, and any interference by law enforcement outside of a direct and articulable threat to life was grounds for immediate disciplinary action. The story of Imani's ordeal and the staggering verdict became a case study in police academies and paramedic training programs nationwide. The body camera footage, once a piece of evidence, was now a powerful educational tool. It was used to teach new recruits on both sides of the divide about the critical importance of communication, respect, and a clear understanding of roles at an emergency scene. It showed in stark, undeniable detail how arrogance and a rigid adherence to authority could escalate a situation with tragic consequences. Imani eventually returned to work at Station 21. The money from the settlement afforded her financial freedom, but she couldn't imagine doing anything else. The ambulance, the adrenaline, the profound privilege of being the person someone called on the worst day of their life. It was a part of who she was. Things were different, though. When she arrived at scenes, police officers treated her with a new level of respect, almost a reverence. They kept their distance. They offered help. They deferred to her medical judgment. Her battle had created a safer environment for all of her colleagues. She had fought the war so they could do their jobs in peace. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, it becomes possible to see the intricate web of choices and circumstances that led to that sun-drenched confrontation on the highway. What drove Officer Kyle Brennan? It wasn't simple malice. It was something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he came from a background where strength was equated with control, and any challenge, especially from a woman, a black woman, in a position of expertise, was perceived not as a difference of professional opinion, but as a direct threat to his identity. He had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, and in his mind, Imani's refusal to comply made her just another threat. His badge was not a tool for service, it was armor for his fragile ego. If Brennan had been able to pause, to listen, to see the dying man on the ground as a person instead of a prop in his own power play, the entire tragedy could have been averted. If his training had emphasized de-escalation and interagency respect as much as it emphasized officer safety and control, he might have become Imani's greatest ally on that roadside instead of her worst obstacle. And what of Imani? If she had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of her past, would she have backed down? If she hadn't possessed that core of steel, perhaps she would have made the easy choice to show her ID, gambling with a stranger's life to avoid a confrontation. The victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of preparation that had unknowingly armed her for that specific fight. Her refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. This story reminds us that true courage isn't about being confrontational. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is a firm, quiet, and unshakable no. What do you think is the most important lesson from Imani's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.